Charlie told me once that the worst thing about his divorce wasn't losing his wife. It was realizing he'd had 10 years of chances to say something honest and chose comfortable silence every single time. He said this from my couch at 2 in the morning, holding a beer he wasn't really drinking. I told him that was rough. Then I walked into my garage and kept sanding a bookshelf I was building for the woman I loved to give to another man. My name is Leo Marin, I'm 39. 3 years ago, I was carrying a woman down a stairwell in a burning duplex on Chestnut Street when my left knee decided it had done enough. The pop was loud enough that my partner heard it over the fire. I finished the carry, got her to the sidewalk, sat down on the curb and couldn't stand back up. 16 years as a firefighter, gone in one sound. The first year after was the worst. I don't mean the pain, though that was bad, I mean the silence. When you spend your adult life inside a firehouse, you don't realize how much of your identity lives in the noise. The tones dropping at 3 in the morning. The diesel engine turning over. Guys yelling at each other over breakfast about nothing that matters. Then one day you're sitting in a kitchen by yourself at noon on a Tuesday, and the only sound is the coffee maker clicking off. I bought the duplex with my pension and disability. Nice place on Maple, 2 units side by side with a shared wall down the middle. I took the left side, put an ad up for the right. June Calloway answered it. She was 31 then. Pediatric physical therapist at the Children's Hospital downtown. She showed up to the walkthrough with a box of her own tools because she wanted to check the water pressure herself. She asked about the furnace, the roof age, the insulation rating. She didn't ask why I walked with a limp. I liked her immediately. That was 5 years ago. 5 years of shared Sunday dinners where she cooked and I did the dishes because she burned things if she tried to multitask. 5 years of her knocking on my door at 11 at night because she heard something in her crawl space that turned out to be a raccoon twice and a possum once. 5 years of her Netflix password on my TV and mine on hers. She was my emergency contact. I was hers. She knew which drawer I kept the ibuprofen in for the bad knee days. I knew she couldn't sleep if she'd lost a patient, and that on those nights she'd come sit in my garage while I worked and not say anything for an hour. She didn't need me to talk. She needed to not be alone in her own space with whatever she was carrying. That's how the woodworking started, actually. Those quiet nights. After I left the department, I needed something to do with my hands. Sitting around watching daytime television was killing me faster than any fire ever could. So I bought a table saw, then a planer, then a lathe. The garage filled up piece by piece until it looked like a proper workshop. Turns out I was good at it. Not the artistic kind of good where people call you gifted. The stubborn kind where you ruin enough wood to eventually learn what it wants to become. I made cutting boards first. Then a coffee table that was slightly uneven but held weight. Then bookshelves, side tables, a headboard for my sister. People started asking if I took commissions. Building things helped. When you're shaping a piece of walnut on the lathe, your hands know exactly what to do. There's a plan, you follow it. The wood either cooperates or it doesn't, but either way you're not sitting in your kitchen wondering who you are without the uniform. June noticed before anyone else. She'd come into the garage with 2 mugs of coffee, hand me one and lean against the doorframe watching me work. Sometimes she'd ask questions. What kind of wood is that? Why did you choose that joint? Is this going to be a table or are you just angry at lumber today? I'd answer, she'd stay. We'd talk about her patients, my projects, the neighbor's dog that barked at nothing from 6 to 7 every single morning. Small stuff, the kind of conversation that doesn't mean anything until you realize you've been having it for years and can't imagine your evening without it. I never told her any of that, obviously. Because here's the thing about living next to someone you love. The wall between you is thin enough to hear her laugh at her TV shows, thin enough to know when she's on the phone with her mother, thin enough that some nights I could hear her humming while she did the dishes. But it's still a wall. And I'd spent 3 years on my side of it, convincing myself that what we had was better than anything I might ruin by wanting more. She started dating Marcus in February. Marcus Chen, account at some firm downtown, liked old paperbacks and craft beer and apparently treated June well enough that she mentioned him casually, like weather. Marcus and I tried that new Thai place. Marcus bought me these flowers, aren't they nice? Marcus is coming to dinner, is that okay? It was not okay. I said it was fine. That's what you do when you're the best friend. You say fine and you mean it as little as possible, and you hope the smile looks real enough that she doesn't dig deeper. June wasn't stupid. She was the sharpest person I knew, but she trusted what I said because that's what 5 years of honest friendship buys you. The one time you lie, it lands. She brought it up on a Thursday evening in April. We were on my porch, and she had her feet tucked underneath her on the chair the way she always sat, and the light was doing that thing it does in spring where everything turns gold for about 20 minutes before the sun drops. "I need a favor," she said. "Name it." "Marcus's birthday is in 6 weeks. He collects old books, first editions, mostly. He needs somewhere to keep them. Somewhere nice." She looked at me. "Would you build him a bookshelf?" I want to be clear about what happened inside my chest when she asked. It wasn't a crack. It wasn't dramatic. It was more like a drawer sliding open that I'd been keeping shut, and everything I'd stored in there shifting around at once. She wanted me to build something for him. With my hands in my garage. The same garage where she sat with me on the bad nights. "Sure," I said. "I can do that." Her face opened up. That smile. The one where her eyes went first and her mouth followed. "Really? You don't have to. I know you're busy with the Hendersons' dining table. I'll fit it in. Just give me the dimensions of the space, and I'll draw something up." "You're the best," she said. She reached over and squeezed my arm. Her hand was warm. She held on for maybe 2 seconds longer than she needed to. Then she let go, stood up, and said she'd text me the measurements tomorrow. I sat on the porch for a long time after she went inside. The thing about being good with your hands is that people assume you're good with things that are hard. Heavy lifting. Difficult repairs. Physical pain. And they're right, mostly. But nobody ever warns you that the hardest thing you'll do with your hands is build something beautiful for someone who will never know what it cost you. I went into the garage that night and started sketching. Not because I was ready, because if I sat still I was going to think too much, and thinking had never done me any good when it came to June. Charlie showed up 3 days later. He pulled into my driveway at 10 at night in a sedan that looked like it had been packed in a hurry. Duffel bag in the back seat, shaving kit on the passenger floor. His face looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in about 2 weeks. Charlie Voss. We'd been at Station 14 together for 9 years. He was my partner on more calls than I can count. The kind of guy who'd carry your gear without being asked and never mention it afterward. Solid. Steady. The last person you'd expect to show up on someone's doorstep, looking like the ground had shifted under him. "Sarah and I are done," he said. I stepped aside. "Couch is yours." He walked in, dropped the duffel by the door, and sat down like the couch was the first surface that had agreed to hold him in days. I got 2 beers, handed him one. He took it and held it without drinking. "What happened?" I asked. 10 years, he said. 10 years, and I never once told her what she actually meant to me. Not the greeting card version, the real version. And she finally got tired of trying to read my mind. He looked at the bottle in his hands, turned it slowly. "She didn't leave because I was bad to her, Leo. She left because I was nothing to her. I was present and accounted for. That's it. I was wallpaper that took out the trash." I didn't say anything for a while. Sometimes the best thing you can offer someone is proof that their words landed somewhere. "I keep thinking about all the times I almost said something," he continued. Saturday mornings, random Tuesday nights. That trip to the coast where we sat on the balcony and the whole ocean was right there, and I thought, this is the moment, and instead I asked her if she wanted to order pizza. He laughed, not because it was funny. "You know what the worst part is?" "What?" She would have stayed. If I'd said it even once. If I'd said, "Sarah, you are the only person whose opinion of me I can't survive losing," she would have put her bags down. I know it. She told me that, at the end. She told me she'd been waiting for 10 years to hear me say one real thing. The quiet in my living room after that sentence could have filled a cathedral. I told him that was rough. I meant it. I also meant it in a way I wasn't ready to examine too closely, because Charlie was sitting on my couch describing the exact future I was building for myself, one silent evening at a time. Then I stood up, went into the garage, and turned on the work light. The bookshelf frame was laid out on my bench. Red oak, good grain. I'd been planning to start the cuts that week. I picked up the sanding block and started working the edges of the first board. Slow, even strokes. The sound filled the garage the way it always did, steady and simple, the kind of noise that asks nothing of you. Charlie appeared in the doorway after about 10 minutes. He leaned against the frame, beer still full in his hand, and watched me work. "What's that going to be?" he asked. "Bookshelf." "Who for?" I kept sanding, long, deliberate passes, the grain smoothed under my fingers. "June's boyfriend." Charlie didn't say anything. He took a sip of beer, his first of the night. Then he nodded slowly, like a man watching someone else make a mistake he recognized from personal experience. "Okay," he said quietly. That was it. Just okay. But the way he said about 4 other words he chose not to add. He went back to the couch. I stayed in the garage until almost 2 in the morning, sanding boards that didn't need sanding yet, listening to the sound of my own hands building something for the wrong person. Through the shared wall, I could hear June's TV faintly. Some cooking show she liked. The volume was low, which meant she was falling asleep on her couch again. In about 20 minutes, she'd wake up, shuffle to her bedroom, and the wall would go quiet. I knew this because I'd heard it 1,000 times. I knew everything about the rhythms of her life on the other side of that wall. The morning alarm at 6:15. The shower that ran for exactly 8 minutes. The kettle whistling at 6:40. The front door closing at 7:10. I knew that she stayed up late on Wednesdays because her mother called from the West Coast, and the time zones never worked out. I knew that on nights she couldn't sleep, she'd open the window in her bedroom, and the curtain would shift, and sometimes I'd see it from my kitchen if I happened to be standing there, which I always happened to be. I knew all of this, and I had never once knocked on that wall. The first board was smooth now, perfect, really. Better than it needed to be for a bookshelf that would hold someone else's paperbacks in someone else's apartment. But that's the problem with working with your hands. You can't make them build something ugly just because the destination hurts. The wood doesn't know who it's for. It only knows whether you cared enough to get it right. I cared. That was never the question. I set the board down and turned off the light. In the dark, the garage smelled like sawdust and machine oil, and the coffee June had brought me that morning before work. On the other side of the wall, the TV went silent. A moment later, I heard her footsteps, soft on the hardwood, moving toward her bedroom. I stood there in the dark, listening to her go. Then I went inside, walked past Charlie sleeping on the couch with a full beer still balanced on his chest, and lay down in my bed staring at the ceiling. 6 weeks to build a bookshelf. 6 weeks of June showing up in my garage with coffee, asking how it was coming along, touching the wood I'd shaped, getting excited about something I was making for someone else. 6 weeks of Charlie on my couch, reminding me every night what happens to men who keep their mouths shut for too long. I closed my eyes. Through the wall, everything was quiet. June was asleep. And I was right here, same as always, close enough to hear her breathing if I pressed my ear to the plaster, far enough away that she'd never know I wanted to. I picked the wood on a Saturday morning. Red oak for the frame, walnut for the shelves. 2 different grains that had no business looking good together but did. The walnut was expensive, more than the job called for. Marcus wasn't paying me. June had offered, and I'd said no so fast she laughed. "At least let me cover materials," she said. "It's scrap I already have." It was not scrap I already had. I drove 40 minutes to a mill outside Ridgefield because they carried quarter-sawn walnut with a grain pattern that looked like water moving. I spent an hour sorting through boards, holding each one up to the light, running my thumb along the edge. The guy behind the counter asked if I was building a coffin or a cradle. "Bookshelf," I said. He nodded like that explained everything. It didn't. Back in the garage, I laid the boards across my bench and started sketching. I'd built shelves before, dozens. You measure the space, you pick a standard depth, you cut, you join, you sand, you finish. A good bookshelf takes maybe 2 weeks if you're not rushing. This one was going to take me every minute of those 6 weeks because I kept drawing it wrong. Not wrong. Too good. The first sketch was clean, functional. Straight lines, simple dado joints, a basic face frame. Exactly the kind of thing you build for a guy you don't know and don't care about. I looked at it for 10 minutes and threw it away. The second sketch had through dovetails. Adjustable shelves with brass pin supports. A subtle curve along the top rail that you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it, and even then you'd think it was just how the wood grew. I stared at it and thought, who builds dovetails for an accountant's paperbacks? Someone who isn't building it for the accountant. That's who. I told myself it was professional pride. A craftsman doesn't cut corners because the client doesn't know the difference. I told myself that twice. Then I started cutting joints at 11 at night and didn't stop until 2 in the morning. And somewhere in that silence, I stopped pretending the bookshelf was about Marcus. It was about June's face when she saw it. The way her fingers would move across the walnut and she'd say something like, "Leo, this is too much," and I'd shrug and say it wasn't. And she'd know I was lying, and neither of us would push it further. That's the version of the conversation I rehearsed while cutting dovetails in an empty garage. The measuring sessions were worse. June had given me the dimensions of Marcus's apartment wall. 7 feet tall, 4 feet wide, 12 inches deep. Standard. Except I needed to know the exact clearance around the baseboard and the ceiling height at that particular spot, and whether the floor was level enough to support the weight without shimming. These were reasonable questions. A professional would ask them. I asked them 3 times over 2 weeks. Twice by text, once in person, standing in my garage with a tape measure and a notebook, asking June to describe the wall again while I pretended to be figuring something out. She sat on my work stool, which was covered in sawdust. She didn't brush it off first. She just sat down and crossed her ankles and held her coffee with both hands. And I measured the same board twice, because I forgot the first number before I could write it down. "You're very thorough," she said. "It's structural. It's a bookshelf, Leo, not a bridge. Bookshelves hold weight. If the shelves bow under his collection, I'll never hear the end of it." From Marcus. From myself. She smiled at that, the real one, not the polite one she gave people at work. I knew the difference. The real one started in her eyes and pulled her whole face up with it, and she usually tried to hide it behind her coffee mug, like she was embarrassed by how much of herself it showed. I went back to measuring. The coffee started on a Monday. I was in the garage at 7 in the morning, running the table saw before the heat set in. June knocked on the side door holding 2 mugs. "You're up early," she said. "The oak cups if it gets too warm in here." She handed me the mug. Our fingers touched around the ceramic. I noticed. She didn't seem to, or she did, and she was better at pretending than I was. After that, the coffee became a routine. Every morning I was in the garage, she'd show up, sometimes in her scrubs if she was heading to the hospital, sometimes in a t-shirt and sweatpants if she had the day off. She'd bring coffee, lean against the workbench, and stay. Not for a few minutes, for an hour, sometimes longer. She'd watch me work and ask questions. Not the kind people ask when they're being polite. Real questions. Why I chose walnut over cherry. How dovetail joints were different from box joints. Why the grain direction mattered when you were gluing panels. She listened to the answers like they were interesting, which either meant she was fascinated by woodworking or fascinated by something else, and using the woodworking as a reason to stand 3 feet away from me in a warm garage. I didn't let myself think about the second option. Not once, not even a little. One afternoon she was holding the end of my tape measure against the far side of a shelf panel while I marked the cut line. She was concentrating, biting the corner of her lip, holding the metal tab flat against the wood with her thumb. Our hands were about 8 inches apart. I could smell her shampoo, something with coconut. "You're shaking," she said. "Sawdust in my eye." "Both of them?" "It's aggressive sawdust." She laughed. Not the quiet kind. The kind that came from her stomach and filled the entire garage and made the dust motes jump in the light coming through the window. I held the pencil against the wood and waited for my hand to stop betraying me. That laugh lived in the garage after she left. I could still hear it while I was cutting the panel, while I was fitting joints, while I was sweeping the floor before locking up. It hung in the sawdust like a thing with weight. She started staying for dinner on the days she helped. Nothing formal. I'd grill something on the back patio. She'd make a salad, because she insisted my diet was going to kill me before I turned 40. We'd eat at the little table I'd built from reclaimed barnwood, and the conversation would drift the way it always did with us. Patience projects, the neighbor's dog, Charlie's latest failed attempt to cook anything more complicated than toast. It felt like a date. It felt nothing like a date. It felt like the space between those two things where you could stay forever if you didn't look down. Charlie saw everything, of course he did. He'd appear in the garage doorway while June was there, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed and his beer in one hand. He'd watch the two of us for a while. June chatting, me pretending to concentrate, both of us circling each other like the garage was a room with walls we'd agreed not to mention. He never said a word, not while she was there. But sometimes after June went home, he'd drift back to the doorway and stand there while I cleaned up. "Nice shelf," he'd say. "Thanks." "Coming along." "Yep." Then he'd take a sip and walk away, and the silence he left behind was louder than anything he could have said. One night I was hand-fitting a dovetail pin, delicate work, the kind where you shave 1/1000th of an inch at a time with a chisel until the joint slides together with just friction and faith. Charlie was on the couch watching some baseball game he didn't care about. I could hear the crowd noise through the open door. He appeared in the doorway. I didn't look up. "June mentioned Marcus tonight?" he asked. "She said he's taking her to that seafood place on Franklin next week." What? "Nothing, just, she talks about him the way people talk about dentist appointments. Like something she scheduled and plans to get through." I pressed the chisel into the joint. Too hard. The pin cracked along the grain, hairline barely visible, but I'd know it was there every time I looked at the piece. "That's not my business," I said. "You're building the man a bookshelf. I'm building June a favor." He went back to the couch. I stared at the cracked pin for a long time. Then I cut a new one and started fitting it from scratch. The replacement took 45 minutes. I could have filled the crack with glue and sawdust, and nobody would have noticed. But I would have known, and the bookshelf was not going to have anything wrong with it. Not this bookshelf, not this one. June told me things about Marcus in small pieces, never a big conversation. Just fragments dropped into our garage talks like seeds she didn't know she was planting. Marcus liked his coffee black. He ran 3 miles every morning. He organized his books by color, which June thought was cute and I thought was a sign of deep personal chaos. He'd grown up in Portland. He had a younger sister he was close to. He was polite and consistent and always texted back within the hour. She never said he made her laugh until she couldn't breathe. She never said he stayed up late arguing about nothing important. She never said he knew what she needed before she asked. She said he was nice. She said it a lot. Nice was her most common word for Marcus, and every time she used it, I pressed the chisel a little harder into the joint I was cutting. I built resentment into that bookshelf. I'm not proud of it, but it's true. Every dovetail I cut was a conversation I wasn't having. Every edge I smoothed was a sentence I swallowed. The joinery got tighter and more precise as the weeks went on, because I was pouring everything I couldn't say into the only language my hands understood. And the bookshelf responded. It became the best thing I'd ever built. The dovetails locked together like they'd grown that way. The walnut shelves caught the light and turned it warm. The top rail had that subtle curve that made the whole piece feel alive somehow, like it was breathing. I was building a love letter, disguised as furniture and pretending I didn't know it. Charlie came into the garage one night near the end of week 3. He was holding a beer as usual, but his face was different, softer, less guarded. He sat down on the stool June usually used, and I noticed he sat carefully, like it mattered where he put himself. "I built Sarah a garden shed," he said. I looked up from the shelf I was sanding. Back in 2016, she wanted one for her seedlings. I spent 3 months on it, cedar siding, copper roof flashing, built raised beds inside on both walls. I even put in a little window facing east so the morning light would come in right. He paused, took a sip he didn't swallow. It was the best thing I ever built. Every joint was tight, every measurement was perfect. I drove to 4 different suppliers for the right cedar. Spent twice what I told her I spent. She didn't know that part. She didn't know any of it. I mean, she saw me building it. She thanked me when it was done. She planted her tomatoes and her herbs and her flowers. And every spring that shed came alive, and she'd spend Saturday mornings in there with the door open and the radio playing. His voice went quiet. I never once walked into that shed and told her what it meant. That I built it because she was the only good thing in my life, and I didn't know how to say that with words. So I said it with cedar and copper and a window that faced east. He looked at the bookshelf frame on my bench. Then he looked at me. She told me at the end that she'd been waiting 10 years for me to walk into that shed and say one real thing. 10 years, Leo. And I built the most beautiful shed in the county and never said a word inside it. The sanding block stopped in my hand. "I'm not telling you what to do," he said. "I lost the right to give advice about this stuff. But I'm sitting on your couch because I built something beautiful for the woman I loved and thought that was the same as telling her." He stood up, walked to the doorway, stopped. "It's not the same." Then he was gone. Back to the couch, back to the ball game, back to the beer he'd nursed for the rest of the night, until the bottle went warm. I stood in the garage holding the sanding block and looking at the bookshelf taking shape on my bench. Red oak and walnut, dovetails so tight they'd last 100 years. A curve along the top rail that nobody would notice unless they ran their fingers over it. I was building the shed. I knew it. Charlie knew it. The bookshelf knew it, if a bookshelf could know anything. I picked up the block and went back to sanding. Slow, even strokes, the way I'd done it every night for 3 weeks. The grain smoothed under my fingers, the wood warmed to my touch. Through the wall, I heard June's front door open, her keys on the hook, the sound of her kicking off her shoes in the hallway, then music, something soft. She was in the kitchen, probably making tea. In 4 weeks, I'd hand this bookshelf to Marcus. He'd put it in his apartment. He'd fill it with old paperbacks organized by color. June would visit and run her fingers across the walnut shelves I'd picked for the grain pattern, and she'd think, "Leo does good work." And that would be it. That would be the entire sentence. Good work. Nothing more. I sanded until my arms burned. Then I sanded some more. The shelf was already smooth, already perfect, already more than a bookshelf should ever need to be. But I wasn't done. Because the only thing worse than building something for the wrong person was finishing it. Finishing meant handing it over. Finishing meant there was no reason left for June to come to the garage every morning, with 2 mugs of coffee and sawdust on her sweatpants, and that laugh that filled every corner of the room. Finishing meant the project was over, and without the project, what excuse did I have to stand 3 feet away from her and pretend the sawdust was the reason my hands were shaking? The music through the wall changed, something slower. She was moving to the living room now. I heard the couch creak softly. In about 20 minutes she'd fall asleep there, and the music would keep playing until it reached the end of whatever playlist she'd put on. I set down the sanding block and stood in the quiet garage, surrounded by the smell of walnut and oak and the ghost of her coconut shampoo. 3 more weeks. 3 more weeks of mornings and coffee and her fingers on the tape measure and that laugh. Then it was done. Then Marcus got his bookshelf, and June went back to being my neighbor, and the garage went quiet again. I turned off the light. In the dark, the half-finished bookshelf sat on my bench like a promise I was making to the wrong person. Every joint I'd cut was a word I hadn't said. Every surface I'd smoothed was a conversation I'd traded for the sound of sandpaper. Charlie was right. Building something beautiful isn't the same as saying what it means. I knew that. I'd known it since the night she asked me to build the thing. But knowing isn't doing, and doing is the part that terrifies you. I walked inside. Charlie was asleep on the couch. The TV was off. His beer was on the coffee table, still 2/3 full. Through the shared wall, June's music played softly. She was asleep now, too. I could tell by the way the apartment had gone still except for the song. 3 weeks left. And the bookshelf was getting more beautiful every day, which meant I was running out of wood to hide behind. The wood was getting thin, not the boards on my bench. Those were fine. Plenty of walnut left, plenty of oak. I mean the excuse. The reason for the mornings and the coffee and the sound of her laugh trapped in sawdust. Every joint I fit brought the bookshelf closer to done, and done was the thing I'd been avoiding since the night she asked. 2 weeks left. Delivery date set for Marcus's birthday. June had circled it on my kitchen calendar with a green marker. Like she lived here, like the calendar was hers too. I didn't say anything about that. I never said anything about any of it. The Sunday dinners shifted first. We'd been doing them for years. Every Sunday at 6, her place or mine, alternating. The routine was simple. She'd cook something ambitious that usually worked. I'd do the dishes. Charlie would eat whatever was offered and contribute nothing except commentary on the seasoning, which he was never right about. But the dinners in late May felt different. Not in the obvious ways. She still cooked, I still washed, Charlie still complained about the salt. The food was the same, the table was the same, the chairs hadn't moved. The silences had changed. Before, silence between me and June was comfortable. The kind you earn after 5 years of talking about everything that doesn't matter and some things that do. We could sit on my porch and not speak for 20 minutes, and it felt like a full conversation. Now the silences had edges. She'd hand me a plate and our fingers would brush, and neither of us would pull back quickly enough. I'd look up from the sink and catch her watching me from the table, and she wouldn't look away the way she used to. She'd hold it for half a second longer, then blink and reach for her wine glass like nothing happened. Something was happening. Charlie noticed. I could see it in the way he looked between us during those dinners, like a man watching a slow-motion collision from a safe distance. He'd take a sip of his beer, and his eyes would move from June to me to June again, and then he'd stare at his plate with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and grief. He recognized what he was seeing. He'd lived it. He'd lived the whole thing from start to finish, except his version ended with a sedan packed in a hurry and a duffel bag on my doorstep. One night after dinner, June was on the porch and I was inside drying the last pan. Charlie was leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms folded. "She didn't mention Marcus once tonight," he said. I dried the pan, set it on the rack, straightened it so the handle faced the same direction as the others. "She doesn't always talk about him. She used to, every dinner. Marcus this, Marcus that. The Thai place, the flowers, the seafood restaurant. So tonight, she talked about your bookshelf for 45 minutes and her eyes didn't leave your face for 30 of them." I hung the towel on the oven handle, folded it twice. My hands needed something to do that wasn't this conversation. "That's because she's excited about the gift." "Lio." "What?" "She's not excited about the gift." I looked at him. He looked back at me with the steady eyes of a man who had ruined the best thing in his life by staying quiet and was watching me do the same thing in real time. "I'm not doing this," I said. "No," he agreed. "You're not, that's the problem." He pushed off the counter and walked back to the living room. I heard the couch creak. The TV came on. Some late-night show he didn't care about. Through the window, June was still on the porch. She had her knees pulled up to her chest and her chin resting on them, looking out at the street. The porch light caught her profile, and I stood there at the kitchen window like an idiot, holding a dry towel and a clean pan, watching a woman I'd loved for 3 years sit 15 feet away from me in a quiet I didn't know how to cross. Then I went into the garage. Because that's what I did. That's what I always did. The garage was the place where I could take everything I felt and press it into wood and pretend that counted. It was a Thursday, well past midnight, when I was lying in bed with the light off, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the house settling. Charlie was asleep on the couch. I could hear him breathing through the open bedroom door. Then I heard June. It came through the wall, thin enough to hear laughter, thin enough to hear humming, thin enough to hear music, and thin enough to hear crying. Quiet crying, the kind a person does when they think nobody can hear them. Muffled, like her face was pressed into a pillow. It came in waves. A few seconds of shaking breath, then silence, then more. I lay there and listened. Not because I wanted to. Because the wall was right there, inches from my headboard, and her bed was on the other side, and I couldn't unhear it. I couldn't unknow that June was crying alone at 1 in the morning on a Thursday in May. My hand went to the wall, flat palm against the plaster. I could feel the faintest vibration when the crying came, like the wall itself was breathing. I should have knocked. A friend would knock. A friend would walk around to her front door and say, "Hey, I heard you. Are you okay?" That's what 5 years of trust buys you. The right to show up when it matters. I didn't knock. I lay there, with my palm against the wall and my eyes on the ceiling, and I didn't move. Because I knew that if I knocked, she'd open the door. And if she opened the door, she'd be standing there with red eyes and wet cheeks, and I'd have to look at her and be only her friend. I'd have to say something kind and neutral and supportive. I'd have to listen to whatever was wrong and offer comfort that stayed inside the lines we'd drawn. And I didn't trust myself to do that. Not at 1 in the morning, not with the sound of her still in my ears. So I stayed, palm on the wall, close enough to feel her, too far to help. The crying stopped after about 20 minutes. I heard her get up. The bathroom sink ran for a while. Then her bed shifted again and everything went still. I stayed awake for another hour. My hand stayed on the wall. In the morning, she knocked on my door at 7 with 2 coffees and a smile that almost reached her eyes. She was wearing the t-shirt she slept in, the gray one with the faded hospital logo, and sweatpants with paint on the left knee from when she helped me stain a side table last summer. "Morning," she said. "Morning." I took the coffee. Our fingers touched on the mug. I searched her face for evidence of the night before. Her eyes were clear. If she'd been crying 6 hours ago, she'd erased every trace. "The bookshelf's almost done," I said. 2 more sanding coats in the finish." "That's fast." "I've been working late." She looked at me for a beat. Then she smiled, the real one, and said, "You always take better care of things than you need to." She went back to her side. I stood in my kitchen holding the coffee and thinking about that sentence for a long time. Charlie confronted me 2 days later. Not the careful hints, not the quiet looks across the room. He came with the full weight of it. It was a Saturday afternoon and June was at work. I was in the garage running the final sanding pass on the frame. Charlie walked in and sat down on June's stool and didn't say anything for about 5 minutes. Just watched me work. I could feel him building towards something the way you feel weather changing. "I need to say something to you," he said. I figured. "You're building furniture for the wrong person." I stopped sanding. The block sat in my hand. The garage was quiet except for the dust settling. "Don't," I said. "I have to. Because nobody said it to me and I needed somebody to say it to me. It's not the same. It's the same shelf, Leo. Different wood. Same guy standing in the same garage, putting everything he feels into something he's going to hand to somebody else. And then pretend that was enough. She's with Marcus. She's with Marcus because you never gave her a reason to be with you." That landed harder than I expected. I set the sanding block down on the bench. My hand was shaking again, and this time there was no sawdust to blame it on. If you've been listening to this story, and it reminds you of someone you know, or maybe someone you are, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one on the channel. "She's my best friend," I said. "If I say something and she doesn't feel the same way, I lose everything." You're already losing everything. You're losing it one sanding pass at a time. You're losing it every morning she brings you coffee and you swallow what you want to say. You're losing it right now, building the most beautiful thing in this garage for a man she describes as nice. Nice isn't bad. Nice is what you call the weather when nothing better happened. I didn't have an answer for that. Charlie had spent 6 months on my couch, turning his regret over in his hands like a stone he couldn't put down. He'd earned the right to this speech. I didn't have to like it. I can't, I said. You can, you just won't. Same result. No, one is a wall you can't get through. The other is a door you refuse to open. They look the same from the outside. They feel very different on the inside. He stood up and looked at the bookshelf frame on my bench, then ran his hand along the top rail, the curve that nobody would notice unless they touched it. This is the most honest thing you've ever made, he said quietly, and you're going to give it to the wrong person. Then he went back inside, back to the couch and the TV and the beer he'd nurse until it went warm. I stood in the garage for a long time after that, looking at the bookshelf and thinking about doors and walls and the difference between them. The following Tuesday, June called me at 6 in the evening. I was in the garage. I was always in the garage now. The bookshelf was nearly complete, and I was running out of legitimate reasons to keep touching it. I need help with the final sanding coat, she said. I know that's your thing, but I want to help. I want to be part of it. It's Marcus's birthday present. You're already part of it. I know. I want to physically be part of it. I want to touch it. Something in her voice that I couldn't place. Something careful and searching. When? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. I was supposed to go to dinner with Marcus tonight. I'll cancel. I should have told her not to cancel. A friend would tell her not to cancel a date with her boyfriend to sandwood in a garage. A friend would say, go to dinner. The shelf will be here tomorrow. Okay, I said. She showed up 30 minutes later in old jeans and a flannel shirt she'd stolen from my closet months ago, and never returned. I never asked for it back. She rolled the sleeves up to her elbows, and I handed her a sanding block and showed her the direction of the grain. We worked side by side for 3 hours. She sanded the shelves while I sanded the frame. We didn't talk about Marcus. We didn't talk about the canceled dinner. We didn't talk about what it meant that she was here instead of there, running her hands over walnut in my garage on a Tuesday night while her boyfriend ate alone. We talked about the wood. She asked why it was warm to the touch. I told her walnut holds heat better than most hardwoods. She asked why the grain moved the way it did, those swirling patterns that looked like rivers on a map. I told her about how the tree grew, how the branches forked, how every knot and curve was a record of something the tree survived. She ran her fingers along a shelf and said, so the scars are what make it beautiful. I looked at her hands on the wood. Her fingers were dusty with walnut. Her forearms were bare beneath the rolled sleeves of my flannel shirt. Usually, I said. She met my eyes. The garage was warm and quiet and full of sawdust, and the last light of the evening was coming through the window behind her. Leo. Yeah. She opened her mouth, then closed it, looked back at the shelf. Nothing. This wood is beautiful. Yeah. You did something special with it. It's just sanding. Patience and pressure. She smiled at that. A private one. Like she'd heard something in the sentence I hadn't meant to put there. We finished around 10. She helped me wipe the dust off every surface with a tack cloth, which was unnecessary. The next coat would need sanding again anyway, but we did it together, slowly, carefully, running the cloth over every inch of the shelves, and the only sound was the soft scraping of fabric on wood and our breathing. She left at 10:30. At the door of the garage, she turned back and said, "Thank you for letting me be part of this." "You were always part of it," I said. The sentence came out before I could stop it. She looked at me. I looked at her. The garage held its breath. Then she smiled, nodded once, and went home. I stood in the doorway and watched her walk around to her side of the duplex, heard her front door open, close, the lock turning, then her footsteps, soft on the hardwood, moving toward her kitchen. I went back inside. Charlie was awake on the couch, not pretending to watch TV this time, just sitting there with his beer on the table. "You told her to cancel a date with her boyfriend so she could sand a shelf in your garage," he said. She offered. "And you said yes." "Yes." He picked up his beer and took a long sip, then set it down. "Progress," he said. I didn't answer. I went into the garage and turned on the work light and stared at the bookshelf in the middle of the night, with nobody beside me, and the smell of her still on the flannel she'd borrowed. It was 3 in the morning when I finished the final coat of oil. Tongue oil hand-rubbed 4 coats over 3 weeks, and this was the last one. I wiped it on slowly with a cotton rag, following the grain the way I'd taught June earlier that evening. The walnut drank the oil and came alive. The grain deepened. The color shifted from pale brown to something warm and rich, like honey held up to firelight. The bookshelf was done. I sat on the stool and looked at it. Red oak frame with walnut shelves, threw dovetails at every corner, brass pin supports for the adjustable shelves, a subtle curve along the top rail that you wouldn't notice unless you ran your fingers over it, which she had. Earlier tonight, her hand had traced that curve and she'd said, "This is beautiful." She was right. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever built. And in 4 days I was going to load it into my truck, drive it across town to Marcus's apartment and leave it there. Marcus would fill it with old paperbacks organized by color. June would visit and see it against his wall, and she'd say, "Leo does such good work." And Marcus would nod, because what else do you say when your girlfriend's best friend builds you something like this for free? And that would be it. The bookshelf would live in Marcus's apartment, and I would live on my side of the wall, and the garage would go quiet, and the coffee mugs would go down to 1, and the mornings would go back to what they were before, silent and functional and survivable. I sat in the garage staring at the bookshelf at 3 in the morning, and I understood finally what I was looking at. I was looking at the end. Not the end of the project. The end of the excuse. 3 weeks of mornings with June in my garage, and every one of them was borrowed time I'd been spending like a man who didn't know his account was empty, was the reason she came. Without it, she had no reason to stand 3 feet away from me with sawdust in her hair and my flannel shirt on her shoulders. And that laugh that lived in the room after she left. Finishing the shelf meant handing her to someone else. Not in the dramatic way. Not like a father giving away a bride. In the quiet, ordinary way. The way you hand someone their coat and they walk out the door, and you stand in the hallway listening to their footsteps get softer. Until the only thing left is the sound of your own breathing in an empty house. I looked at my hands. They were stained with tung oil and walnut dust. Good hands, capable hands. Hands that had carried people out of burning buildings and shaped raw wood into beautiful things. Hands that had never once reached across 3 feet of garage air and taken hers. Charlie's voice in my head. Not the speech from Saturday, an earlier one. The one from his first night on my couch, when he held a beer he wasn't drinking and said, "She would have stayed if I'd said one real thing." I looked at the bookshelf. Every joint was perfect. Every surface was smooth. The curve along the top rail was so subtle it felt like an accident, like something the wood had always wanted to be. It was the most honest thing I'd ever made, and I was 4 days from giving it away. Through the wall, everything was silent. June was asleep. The whole neighborhood was asleep. The only light in the world was my garage, and the only person awake was me, sitting on a stool at 3 in the morning, understanding for the first time that finishing something can be the same as losing everything. 4 days. The truck was ready. The blankets were folded in the bed to protect the wood during transit. Marcus's birthday was Saturday. I turned off the work light and sat in the dark with the smell of tung oil and the ghost of June's laugh and the quiet certainty that I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. The question was which mistake. Saturday came whether I was ready for it or not. I wrapped the bookshelf in moving blankets at 6 in the morning, took my time folding the corners tight so the walnut wouldn't get scratched on the truck bed rails. I used ratchet straps because bungee cords are for people who don't care what they're carrying, and I cared about this more than I had any right to. The sky was gray, that flat early summer gray that can't decide if it wants to rain or just threaten. I stood in the driveway looking at the bookshelf in my truck, all bundled up and strapped down, and it looked like a body under a sheet. I know that's a dark thing to think. I thought it anyway. Charlie was awake when I came back inside. That was unusual. He'd spent 6 months on my couch, perfecting the art of sleeping until 11. Then staring at the ceiling for another hour before admitting the day existed. But this morning he was sitting up with his feet on the floor and his hands on his knees. The couch blanket was folded beside him, which he'd never done, not once in 6 months. His duffel bag was by the front door, packed. I stopped in the kitchen doorway. "You leaving?" He looked at me. His eyes were clearer than I'd seen them since the night he showed up. Still tired, still carrying the weight of a marriage he'd let die in silence. But something had shifted, like a window he'd been pressing against had finally opened a crack. "My sister's got a spare room in Tacoma," he said. "I called her last night." I leaned against the frame. "You could have told me." "I'm telling you now." "That's not the same." "No," he almost smiled. "It's not." He stood up and looked around the living room, like he was memorizing it. Or maybe saying goodbye to the version of himself who'd lived in it for half a year. "I want to say something," he said. "Okay." He looked at me directly with the steady expression he used to wear in the truck on the way to a call, when we both knew what we were driving into, and words would just slow us down. "Don't deliver it." I didn't answer. "Leo, don't deliver the bookshelf to Marcus. It's his birthday present." It's the most honest thing you've ever made, and he's going to put spy novels on it organized by the color of the spine. You and I both know who that shelf belongs to. My jaw tightened. I picked up my keys from the counter, put them down, picked them up again. It's not that simple. I know it's not. Nothing about this is simple. That's how you know it's real. He walked to the front door, picked up his duffel, slung it over his shoulder, and looked at me one more time. Sarah asked me for one real thing. 10 years, one real thing, and I built her a cedar shed with a copper roof and a window facing east, and I never walked inside it and said the words. His voice didn't crack. He'd carried this long enough that it came out smooth, like a stone he'd turned over in his hands, so many times the edges were gone. You have something better than a shed. You have a bookshelf with dovetails so tight they'll last a century. And you know you finished it at 3 in the morning and sat there in the dark because you couldn't let go of it. Don't hand that to the wrong person just because the right one scares you. He opened the door. Morning light came in. Thank you for the couch, he said. Charlie. He turned. The spare room in Tacoma. Is that a step, or are you just moving the couch? He looked at me for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. My sister knows a therapist. I have an appointment on Wednesday. Something loosened in my chest. Not relief, something closer to respect. Good, I said. Yeah, he shifted the duffel on his shoulder. Good. He walked to his sedan, put the bag in the back seat, and drove away. I watched him turn left on Maple and disappear behind the hedgerow at the corner. 6 months of Charlie Voss, condensed into a folded blanket and a ring on the coffee table. I stood there for a while. Then I walked to the truck. Marcus's apartment was 22 minutes away. Ground floor unit in one of those newer complexes off Pine, the kind with identical balconies and assigned parking, and a lobby that smelled like manufactured citrus. June had described it once as clean. That was the word she used. Clean. I drove there on autopilot, pulled into the visitor lot, and cut the engine. And then I sat in the truck for 20 minutes. Not because I was thinking. I'd done all the thinking I could stand, 3 weeks of it, 3 years of it. I was just sitting the way you sit after a long shift when you get back to the station, and the call is over but your hands haven't gotten the message yet. They're still gripping something. I knew who the bookshelf was for. I'd known since the second sketch, the one with the through dovetails and the brass pins and the curve along the top rail. Nobody builds that for an acquaintance. Nobody drives 40 minutes to a mill outside Ridgefield for quarter-sawn walnut because their neighbor's boyfriend likes old paperbacks. I looked at the apartment building through the windshield. Beige stucco, uniform windows. A place where you put things that fit. The bookshelf didn't fit here. I turned the key. The drive back to Maple took 22 minutes. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the truck for another minute, because this next part was going to change everything, and I wanted one more minute of before. Then I got out, walked around to the truck bed, unstrapped the bookshelf, and lifted it myself. My left knee screamed the way it always does when I ask it to carry something heavy, and I asked it anyway. I carried it around the side of the duplex to June's front door. She wasn't home. Saturday morning she volunteered at the children's clinic until noon. I had the spare key. She'd given it to me 3 years ago for emergencies, and I'd never used it for anything except watering her plants when she visited her mother in Portland. I let myself in. Her living room smelled like her. Coconut shampoo and something warm that I'd never been able to name but would recognize anywhere. A mug on the coffee table, with a tea bag still in it, patient files on the chair by the window, a throw blanket bunched at one end of the couch. I set the bookshelf against the wall opposite her couch, the wall she could see from the kitchen, the wall she'd look at every morning when she walked in with her coffee. It looked right here. The warm walnut and the red oak frame and the soft curve of the top rail, all of it looked like it had been built for this room, for this light, for the woman who lived in this space with her framed prints and her stacked books and her half-finished cup of tea. I stood there looking at it for a minute. Then I went to my side and got a piece of paper. Not the fanny kind, just a sheet torn from the yellow legal pad I used for project measurements. The same pad where I'd sketched the first design, where I'd written down the dimensions. June texted me. 7 by 4 by 12, Marcus's wall. I sat at my kitchen table with a pencil and wrote. I didn't write a love letter or a speech. I'm not that kind of man, and June would have seen through it in a second. She knew me too well for performance. I wrote measurements. 7 feet by 4 feet by 12 inches. Those were the dimensions you gave me. But the bookshelf is 42 inches tall, 36 inches wide, and 14 inches deep. Those are different numbers. 42 is the exact height of the windowsill in my garage, where you set your coffee every morning. 36 is the width of the workbench, where you sat and watched me cut dovetails, and I forgot the measurements because your shampoo smells like coconut and my hands don't work right when you're 3 feet away. 14 is the depth of the shelf beside my bed, the one against our shared wall, where I keep the things that matter most. I built this to the dimensions of my garage, my bench, my wall, the places where you showed up every morning for 3 weeks and turned sawdust into the best part of my day. I didn't build Marcus's bookshelf. I never did. Every joint in this is something I wanted to say to you and didn't. Every surface I sanded was a morning I should have put down the sanding block and picked up your hand instead. You deserved the truth a long time ago. Here it is, in the only language I'm any good at. The bookshelf is yours. It was always yours. I'm on my side of the wall if you want to talk. Leo. I folded the note, walked back into June's apartment, and set it on the second shelf from the top, leaning against the back panel. A person would only find it if they ran their hands across the walnut the way she always did, feeling the grain, pressing her fingers into the wood like she was reading something written there. Then I went home, locked her door behind me, walked into my side of the duplex, and sat down on my bed with my back against the shared wall. And waited. It was 12:40 when I heard her car, the engine cutting off, the door closing, her keys jingling the way they always did, because she kept too many keychains on the ring. Her front door opened, her shoes came off in the hallway. Then nothing. I could hear the silence through the wall, the specific silence of a person who has walked into a room and found something that wasn't there when she left. I heard her footsteps after about a minute, slow and careful, moving toward the bookshelf. I could picture her standing in front of it, head tilted the way she did when she was trying to understand something. Then I heard the small sound. Not a word, just a breath. The kind of breath you take when your hand finds something on a shelf that you weren't expecting, and you start to read it, and the world shifts under your feet. I pressed my palm flat against the wall, the same spot, the place where I'd felt her crying 2 weeks ago and hadn't knocked, the place where 5 years of proximity and silence had calcified into something I'd mistaken for safety. My hand was shaking, both of them, and there was no sawdust to blame. 3 or 4 minutes passed, I couldn't tell. Time does something strange when you're sitting on one side of a wall waiting to find out if the person on the other side just read the most honest thing you've ever put on paper. Then the knock came. Not on my front door, on the wall. 3 soft knocks, right where my palm was resting. No words through the plaster, no muffled voice. Just her hand against the wall, a few inches from mine, separated by drywall and 5 years of silence I'd chosen and she'd endured. I knocked back, same softness. For a moment, that was the whole conversation. 2 people on opposite sides of a wall they'd lived behind for 5 years, knocking. Then I heard her front door open and her footsteps on the porch, coming around to my side. I got up, and my knee protested the way it always did, and I ignored it. I walked to the front door and opened it before she knocked. June was standing there holding the note. Her eyes were red, but her face was calm. She was wearing the scrubs from the clinic, and she hadn't taken her hair down yet, and her cheeks were wet, but she wasn't crying anymore. She was past that, standing on the other side of it, looking at me with an expression I'd never seen from her before. It was the look of someone who'd been given back, something they'd stopped believing they'd ever receive. She held up the note, 42 inches. Yeah. The windowsill. Yeah. You measured your garage, not his apartment. I never measured his apartment. I went there, sat in the parking lot, and turned around. She looked at me and I looked at her. The porch was small, 3 feet between us, the same 3 feet that had existed in the garage for 3 weeks, except now there was no workbench in the way and no sanding block and no pretense. Leo. Yeah. I canceled dinner with Marcus 2 weeks ago and came to sand a bookshelf in your garage because I wanted to be in a room with you. I know. I wore your flannel shirt because it smelled like you in the garage, and I didn't want to stop being in that space. I know. I cried through the wall and you didn't knock. That one landed right in the center of my chest. I heard you, I said. I put my hand on the wall. I didn't knock because I was afraid if I saw you I'd tell you everything and you were with Marcus and I didn't know if you wanted to hear it. She stepped closer, 1 foot, the 3 feet became 2. I ended things with Marcus on Thursday, she said. I blinked. Thursday. I sat across from him at that Thai place, and he was telling me about quarterly projections, and I was thinking about the way walnut grain looks like water moving. And I realized I was in the wrong restaurant with the wrong person thinking about the right one. She looked down at the note and read a line aloud quietly. Every surface I sanded was a morning I should have put down the sanding block and picked up your hand instead. She looked up. You should have. I know. You should have put it down and taken my hand and told me 3 years ago. I know that too. So why didn't you? I could have given her the pretty answer. The one about protecting the friendship, about not wanting to ruin what we had. All of that was true. None of it was the real answer. Because I didn't think I was enough, I said. Not the woodworking, not the knee, not the early retirement. I didn't think a man who lost his career to one bad step in a burning building and spent 3 years learning to sandboards was enough for the best person he'd ever known. June's chin trembled, just once. You built me the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, she said, and you carried it 22 minutes to the wrong apartment and then carried it back. On that knee. By yourself. The knee's fine. The knee is not fine, Leo. It got the job done. She laughed. Wet and real and sharp, the kind that breaks open something that's been held too tight for too long. The sound filled the porch the same way it used to fill the garage, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. Can I come in? She asked. I stepped aside and she walked past me into the living room. She looked at the empty couch where Charlie's blanket had been, at the kitchen where we'd eaten 100 Sunday dinners, at the hallway that led to my bedroom and the wall we shared. She turned around. I'm not going to kiss you right now, she said. Okay. Because if I kiss you right now, it'll feel like the end of the story, and this isn't the end. This is the first honest thing we've done in 5 years, and I want us to sit with it. Okay. I want to sit on this couch with you, and drink coffee and not say anything for a while. Can we do that? I nodded. I'll make the coffee. She sat down in the middle of the couch, not the far end. I made 2 cups, brought them over, and sat beside her close enough that our shoulders touched. We didn't talk. The coffee got warm, then cool, then cold. Through the shared wall, I could hear the hum of her refrigerator, the sound of her apartment existing without her in it. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I let her. And I thought about the bookshelf standing against her wall right now, empty except for a note written on yellow legal paper. In a few days, she'd start putting things on it. Her books, her framed prints, the small ceramic bird her mother gave her. Not Marcus's paperbacks organized by color, her things. Charlie was on a highway somewhere heading toward Tacoma, and a spare room and a therapist appointment on Wednesday. 6 months on my couch, and he'd left with a folded blanket and one piece of advice that changed everything. I hoped the spare room was quiet. I hoped the therapist was patient. I hoped he'd walk into a shed someday and say the thing he couldn't say to Sarah. He'd given me the only gift that mattered. Not the speech about the garden shed or the line about doors and walls. He showed me what my life looked like if I kept sanding. June's breathing slowed against my shoulder, even not sleeping, just resting. The way a person rests when they've finally set something down that they've been carrying alone for longer than they should have. I looked at my hands. They were still stained with tongue oil from the final coat, walnut dust in the creases. Good hands. Hands that built things. For 3 years I'd poured everything I felt into wood, because wood was safer than words. You can measure wood. You can shape it. You can sand away the rough parts and oil the surface until it glows. Wood doesn't reject you. Wood doesn't walk to the other side of the wall and close the door. But wood doesn't knock back, either. June shifted beside me and her hand found mine on the couch cushion. She didn't lace our fingers together, or squeeze or make it dramatic. She just set her hand on top of mine, palm to palm, and left it there. Her hand was warm and steady. The hand of a woman who spent her days helping children learn to walk again. Who understood that the hardest steps are the small ones, the ones that don't look brave from the outside. I turned my hand over under hers. Our fingers settled together the way a joint settles into place when the fit is right, without force or adjustment. We sat there. The coffee was cold and the morning was gray. Charlie's couch was empty. The bookshelf was on the wrong side of the wall, which turned out to be the right side. I learned something in those weeks of building, not about wood. About the distance between making something beautiful and letting someone know what it means. A bookshelf can hold 100 books. A note can hold a few sentences. A knock on a wall can hold 5 years. The hardest thing I ever built wasn't the bookshelf with the dovetails and the walnut shelves and the curve along the top rail. It was the nerve to carry it back. If this story reminded you of someone, or of something you haven't said yet, there are more like it on this channel.